It is April 1945. The world that once trembled before Hitler's armies is now crumbling around him. The man who once dominated Europe's grand stages, boasting of a 1,000-year Reich, now hides beneath the shattered remains of Berlin in a cold, damp concrete bunker. For years, he had sustained himself on the illusion of destiny. Every loss, every retreat he dismissed as temporary. The Führer's will cannot be broken, his ministers assured the nation. But in reality, it already had been. Above ground, Berlin burned. The Red Army pressed in from only a few miles away, their artillery shaking the city. Inside the bunker, there was no daylight. Only flickering bulbs, curling cigarette smoke, and the stifling air of despair. Maps still lined the walls, marked with red arrows showing counteroffensives that would never take place. Hitler refused to leave. His generals pleaded with him to escape to the Alps and regroup, but he only laughed bitterly. Surrender. Never. I will not flee like a coward. To him, retreat was synonymous with disgrace. Death was a more acceptable fate than surrender. Yet behind those icy blue eyes, something had shifted. For the first time, Adolf Hitler began to grasp that his world, his empire, his authority, his illusion of destiny, was disintegrating. The first fracture appeared when Ring, his once loyal deputy, sent a message proposing to assume leadership of Germany if Hitler became isolated in Berlin. To any rational leader, it was a sensible suggestion. To Hitler, it was treachery. He erupted in fury, branding Ring a traitor and demanding his arrest. But deep inside, he understood the truth. Even those closest to him no longer believed victory was possible. By this point, nearly every major German city lay in ruins. The Western Allies advanced from one direction, the Soviets from the other. The once mighty Reich was encircled, starving, and fractured. Yet Hitler clung to delusion. He placed his hopes on the so-called Steiner counteroffensive, a last stand under General Felix Steiner, that he believed would repel the Soviets and save Berlin. But Steiner never received the reinforcements and never launched the attack. It was an unworkable command born of desperation. When his aides reported that Steiner had not moved, Hitler lost control. Witnesses recalled him trembling with rage, pounding the table, and shouting that the war was over, and that he had been betrayed by everyone around him. It was the notorious bunker outburst. A moment of grim clarity that none of his closest followers would ever forget. That was the moment when the illusion finally collapsed. For the first time, Hitler uttered the words his men had never imagined hearing: the war is lost. He dismissed everyone from the room. When they returned, his tone was subdued, his face pale and drained, almost spectral. The talk of triumph, destiny, and glory was gone. Now he spoke only of death. He told them he would remain in Berlin and take his own life when the end arrived. The man, who had once commanded a continent with a single word, now sat trembling in the shadows, eyes fixed on the floor. Even the air in the bunker grew heavier, as if all inside could sense history closing in. Outside, the roar of battle crept ever nearer, tanks rolling, artillery pounding. The Soviets had already reached the city center. Berlin was a sea of fire, filled with civilians fleeing through rubble. SS officers burning documents and soldiers too young to shave, being sent to defend streets that no longer existed. Hitler's world, the one built on fear, lies, and iron, was dissolving faster than he could comprehend. But he wasn't just losing a war. He was losing his identity, the godlike image he'd built in his own mind. For years, his propaganda told the German people he was chosen by fate. Now, as the walls of the bunker shook with each explosion, even he began to wonder if fate had abandoned him. In the corner of his desk, he kept a portrait of Friedrich the Great, the Prussian king, who turned near defeat into victory centuries earlier. He stared at it often, as if waiting for a miracle, but none came. By mid-April, reports arrived that his closest allies were gone. Himmler was secretly negotiating with the Allies. Goebbels was breaking down emotionally, and Hitler's once powerful generals were either dead, captured, or fleeing. The man who once commanded millions now ruled over a handful of terrified staff and secretaries, locked underground in a tomb of his own making. And then came the final blow. News that the Soviets were within blocks of the Reich chancellery. The thunder of artillery echoed through the night. The end was no longer a rumor. It was footsteps above him. He knew then there would be no escape, no victory, no redemption, only an ending. But the moment he truly realized it was over wasn't during a meeting or a battle. It happened in silence. It was when he walked into his private quarters, closed the door behind him, and looked in the mirror, and saw not the Führer, not the conqueror of Europe, but an old, broken man waiting for death. The mirror stared back at him, pale skin, trembling hands. Eyes no longer filled with fury, but emptiness. Adolf Hitler, the man who had once promised a new world order, now resembled the ghost of his own creation. He knew the end was coming, but he wanted to choreograph it, to control his final moment as he once controlled nations. If he couldn't win the war, he would at least decide how it ended. He ordered his staff to burn all records that might humiliate him. He gave instructions that his body be destroyed after death. He feared being displayed like Mussolini, hung upside down for the world to see. Even in his final hours, vanity ruled him more than humanity. Outside, the Red Army was storming Berlin street by street. The once proud German capital had turned into a wasteland. Buildings gutted, smoke blackening the sky. The sounds of tanks and flamethrowers echoed through the ruins. Hitler could hear it all. Each explosion felt like another heartbeat of his empire dying. Inside the bunker, food was nearly gone. There was no more water pressure, no electricity in parts of the complex. Secretaries wept quietly at night. Some took cyanide capsules rather than face capture. Even his dog, Blondie, had become part of his delusion. He tested poison on her to make sure it worked. That was the kind of man he had become, a ruler so consumed by fear that he trusted death more than loyalty. By April 29th, the radio brought him the final humiliation. Benito Mussolini, his closest ally, his mirror in Italy, had been captured and executed by his own people, his body mutilated and hung in public. Hitler stared at the report for a long time. He said nothing. Then, in a voice that barely carried, he muttered, "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." That was the moment he accepted death, not as defeat, but as his last act of control. He would decide when the Third Reich ended. That night he married Eva Braun. It was not a wedding born of love. It was ritual, a final illusion of normally before the collapse. They toasted, with cheap champagne, while artillery shook the bunker. Witnesses described him as strangely calm, polite, distant, almost gentle. It was as if the storm inside him had gone silent. But outside that small candle-lit room, everything was over. The Red Army had entered the government district. Gunfire echoed above. Soldiers of the Reich were surrendering or dying in the streets. There was no army left to save him. No fortress left to defend him. Just a bunker beneath a city that no longer existed. When his aides entered the room, they found him slumped on the couch, a pistol still in his hand. Eva Braun lay beside him. A faint smell of cyanide in the air. The man who demanded that millions die for him could not face defeat himself. His guards carried the bodies upstairs to the garden and burned them under the grey Berlin sky, just as he had ordered. Above them, Soviet shells continued to fall. The empire that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga ended in a few feet of ash. When Soviet troops discovered the bunker days later, they found a scene frozen in decay. Mouths scattered, half-eaten food, and desperate notes scribbled on the walls. Everything smelled of smoke, sweat, and fear. In the chamber where Hitler took his life, the air remained thick and unmoving, as if time itself resisted passing. His guards carried the bodies to the garden above and set them ablaze beneath the grey Berlin sky, fulfilling his final command. Overhead, Soviet artillery still rained down. The empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga ended in a handful of ashes. When Soviet soldiers entered the bunker days later, they found a place frozen in ruin. Maps strewn across the floor. Half-eaten meals left behind, frantic notes scrawled on the walls. The stench of smoke, sweat, and fear lingered everywhere. In that room, the weight of history hung heavy, unwilling to lift. The remaining guards surrendered soon after. Berlin fell completely on May 2nd. Within a week, Nazi Germany, the so-called 1,000-year Reich, was finished. It had survived scarcely 12. But the story didn't end there. In the months that followed, rumors spread rapidly that Hitler had escaped, that he was still alive somewhere in South America. For many Germans, believing such tales was easier than accepting the truth. Their Führer had deserted them, just as he had long since abandoned reality. The real moment Hitler lost the war wasn't in that bunker, nor when the Allies crossed the Rhine or the Soviets entered Berlin. It had happened years earlier, when he convinced himself he could not fail, that fate itself was on his side. The bunker was merely where that delusion finally met its end. As Berlin burned, millions across Europe were left in ruin. Families torn apart, cities wiped away, generations marked by pain. And for what? For the delusion of one man who believed himself greater than reality itself. In the end, history does not remember Hitler for his conquests or his words. It remembers the silence that came after. The silence of a devastated city, the silence of an underground bunker, and the silence of a man who finally understood that the world he had forged from hatred could not survive him. The Third Reich did not fall in a glorious battle or a final act of defiance. It ended with a single gunshot echoing through the dark, signaling the downfall of a dictator who thought he could command destiny. And in that instant, the world breathed again. The nightmare had finally ended.